if we don't have secure, stable, and affordable energy to fuel data centers, to fuel artificial intelligence, to fuel quantum research and development, then we're going to be very, very challenged when it comes to competing with China at the cutting edge of technology policy.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in US news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the U.S. Study Center's Briefing Room podcast. My name is Jared Monshine, and I'm the Director of Research here at the U.S. Study Center. And before we get started, I want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose lands I'm recording today and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Today, I'm joined by a visiting fellow named Eric Jacobs. He is an International Affairs Fellow at the Research Institute of the Japanese government's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry. But he is also someone who recently visited us in Sydney and Canberra as a former alum of the Trump administration. He served several roles in the Trump administration, including as policy coordinator for the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Strategic Planning and Policy, and a policy advisor in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy's National Security International Affairs team. So he worked on things like CFIUS, which is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. He worked on emerging technology policy and just more broadly, national security policy. Eric, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Jared, it was great to see you in Sydney earlier this month and looking forward to our conversation today. Thanks.
Awesome. And so just to confirm, one thing we do on the briefing room is ask folks for a number stat at the very end. Are you ready with that stat that we'll share at the end of the episode?
Yeah.
Perfect. So, Eric, there's so much to talk about in terms of emerging technology policy in particular. But I guess one thing that I would like to get your thoughts on first is maybe on this era of strategic competition that we're in. There's a lot of battlefields in my view. There's geographic ones, we can say the Pacific and Southeast Asia is one. Then there's also sort of sectoral ones, and I think technology is one of them. I would love to hear your thoughts on that sort of strategic competition in this age of, in this era of strategic competition, what the battle for sort of technological supremacy looks like. We just, in the past few years, we've seen with AUKUS Pillar 2, focusing a lot on emerging technology. How did you and the Trump administration see this battle, and what was your sort of strategy in terms of dealing with China over the course of your time in the administration on emerging technology?
Well, on the emerging tech issue, obviously this was something that was at the top of mind at the most senior levels within the administration, and it was viewed across many different sectors, technology being one of the critical sectors, as something driving forward not only strategic competition with China, but opportunities to cooperate with our allies. I think early on you saw the efforts to get Huawei and other technologies kind of out of the 5G networks from a national security perspective. That was absolutely critical. Protection of kind of the research and development enterprise within the U.S., identifying some of the threats that come from not only the Chinese researchers, but the hundreds of billions of dollars of intellectual property theft, exfiltration of data, exfiltration of research back to China that has underlied a lot of, and frankly, funded a lot of Chinese growth across their military and industrial complex over the last few decades. That's another issue that at least I thought was very important and at top of mind whenever I was working through some of these issues in the White House. And then on policy-specific issues, obviously, the American Artificial Intelligence Initiative rolled out in 2019 was kind of one of the first steps that the U.S. government made in regarding kind of defining and moving forward on artificial intelligence policy, and that helped lay the groundwork for a lot of the work forward on artificial intelligence when it comes to China. And then I too view now kind of energy security as one of these issues that's going to be absolutely critical for making sure that the next generation of technological development in the U.S. is safe, affordable, and leading the world over the next several decades. Because if we don't have secure, stable, and affordable energy to fuel data centers, to fuel artificial intelligence, to fuel quantum research and development, and to fuel semiconductor and other kind of industries, then we're going to be very, very challenged when it comes to competing with China at the cutting edge of technology policy and development in general.
That's great. So on that energy security issue, one thing that we've looked at the U.S. Study Center is there's a lot of discussion between the Albanese and Biden governments on climate. And they have a climate compact. And one thing that I've said is that, I'm not sure if the Trump administration would be as keen to do explicitly climate-oriented lines of effort. But if they are to focus on the sort of subcomponents of that climate cooperation, which includes battery technology, efforts on hydrogen, efforts on more energy security and supply chain issues, I think that would probably have more opportunities between Australia and the U.S. government, regardless of who wins the U.S. election. Is that something that you see? Did you see that when you were in the Trump administration? Did you see conversations on those things amongst allies and partners?
Well, I think early on, before and then during, in the early days of the pandemic, some of those issues such as critical minerals, secure supply chains, when it comes to the critical and emerging technologies list, especially with kind of a defense focus and the key role that some of these components downstream in the critical minerals supply chain will play in the long-term kind of artificial intelligence, quantum, and military-specific applications. Those types of discussions were definitely going on in the background and then became more prominent as the pandemic went on through things such as the critical minerals executive orders that were signed and other kind of bilateral agreements on the critical minerals issues. Now, President Trump's been very clear during the campaign that climate is not going to be a focus. There will be efforts and moves to leave the Paris Accords again. There will be moves to roll back the Green New Deal, to roll back elements of the Inflation Reduction Act, which President Biden said 2 or 3 weeks ago was a climate plan. Granted, that's a law, so that's going to be more difficult to make some of those changes, potentially depending on the makeup of Congress. So when it comes to the climate compact, I don't know if that is the framework through which a lot of those negotiations and cooperative efforts between the U.S. and Australia will take place. However, if you look at some of the components therein, the critical minerals dialogue and energy security dialogue has been going on for a long time between Australia and the United States. As critical energy producers, I know LNG has been, despite Australia's 2050 net zero targets, LNG has been identified as a technology that is still going to be a focus of the Australian government, at least in the near-term future. Energy technology, very important there on the U.S. side as well. But when it comes to those rare earth metals that have a critical role in the semiconductor supply chain and other supply chains with defense-specific applications, I think there's an opportunity to continue working there together.
Yeah, when I look at sort of the Venn diagram of interests from a military perspective, climate perspective, energy perspective, as well as Democratic and Republican perspective, it really the overlap on critical minerals, touching on all these things is pretty abundantly clear. And so I think that's something that one thing we've set the study center is will likely continue regardless of who wins in November. So then it sounds like the Trump campaign has said that they want to go back to drill, baby, drill, and in terms of their energy policy and making sure, as you said, that we have the sort of baseload energy policy resources available for future technologies. What does that look like from the White House doing? Like, what did you do to support that sort of policy while you were in the White House? What does that look like on the ground from your perspective, executing that sort of strategy?
Well, I wasn't working on that specifically at the White House, but from a 30,000 foot view, I I would anticipate the administration to change the way and expedite permitting process for new exploration, for more mining, definitely for approving projects that maybe have been waiting for quite some time. If it's possible, restarting the Keystone Pipeline discussions. That was something that the Biden administration ended on day one. Lifting the ban on new LNG contracts and exports that the Biden administration put in place. There will be questions about how the electric vehicle mandate will impact the domestic auto industry. So looking into things like that, there's a lot of regulatory changes and kind of policy changes that can be made at a top level on some of these issues. Obviously, taking advantage of the American energy resources through Marcellus Shale, natural gas exploitation, scratch that, Marcellus Shale, natural gas extraction, kind of building out our export industry and essentially driving down the cost of energy, because I think high energy costs lead to inflation. They lead to a higher cost of living. And if one of the reasons why the U.S. is poised, I think, especially if President Trump is reelected to dominate the global economy and the global energy space, will be the ability to get our energy prices down. And that's by going into liquid natural gas, that's by going into oil industry, that's by and all of the above approach when it comes to the American energy sector.
I think that is something that it seems like even Harris in her campaign has pivoted from where she has been in the past on energy. I guess looking at future-oriented industries, if you look at AI and the energy consumption needed for that, and how a lot of big tech firms have actually backed away from their targets because of the compute needed for AI. We've paid a lot of attention to AI in recent years, especially during the Biden administration, but I don't think this is the first time that we've been looking at it. Was that something that you looked at in the Trump administration?
Yeah, I mean, OSTP definitely took this issue very seriously. Michael Kratsios and others in leadership developed the American Artificial Intelligence Initiative, which kind of really went after a holistic approach to how the government was using artificial intelligence, what some of the opportunities were for AI use across the government, and then kind of long-term approaches to AI. And that includes an Artificial Intelligence Executive Order and National Artificial Intelligence Initiative Act that led and promoted the environment for additional AI investment, federal computing resources, development of standards, figuring out what the next generation of the AI-related workforce will look like, and engagement with allies across various international fora. So that was something that we definitely looked at, and I think early on had some major policy wins in that space. But yeah, the energy issue has been emerging. And as I look at this, not only from the American perspective, from what I've learned in Japan this summer and what I've learned in Australia with you guys earlier in the month, I think people need to be taking the energy question a lot more seriously, and at least outside of the US, because we're able to fuel that with nuclear and other means. Because there are stringent climate goals that some governments have, but I think those come in direct conflict with the desire for technological independence and technological growth. Data centers, AI centers, manufacturing centers for semiconductors, quantum compute, they all require an incredible amount of energy. And without stable and reliable base power, which traditionally, and in my view, most affordably, would come from nuclear and conventional fossil fuels, it's going to be very difficult for those industries to grow at the scale that they would like in the future. Relying on kind of solar, wind, geothermal, hydroelectric, that may sound good, but those energies are much more expensive. And at the end of the day, they're not as reliable and stable as more conventional forms of energy that we would need to power those very critical technological centers.
So I guess after talking to a number of folks across Australia and Sydney, Canberra, and government officials, I'd love to hear your pitch on what you think Australia should do to be a better ally in these areas to the U.S. or where are some some areas of opportunity. I've talked about how I see a lot of structural dynamics between the U.S. and Australia staying the same regardless of who wins in November, and how, in many ways, Australia will likely do well under either scenario of in November, but that doesn't mean that the work will be easy, and that Australia really has its work cut out for it regardless of who wins. But what after spending some time here, what do you think, if you have a Canberra audience listening, potentially, what do you think Australia should be focusing on in not just in the months to come, but in the years to come, in terms of being allies with the United States?
Well, first of all, I'd say Australia is definitely one of our closest and most important allies, and that is strong. And at least for me, kind of on the side of national security specific applications with what's going on, there within AUKUS, a lot of the technologies that are listed within Pillar 2, quantum, artificial intelligence, cyber, and just general innovation policy, I think deeper coordination on those issues moving forward is something that's going to be very important and critical to the alliance, because especially in terms of national security specific spaces, these are great opportunities for those with the highly advanced technical skills and the national defense related experience to work together to develop these technologies. China is doing what it's doing, pumping an incredible amount of money into its state-backed enterprises, into its defense industrial base. And it's, I think, imperative for the U.S. to work very closely with our allies in this space. So on the technical side, Australia has a great opportunity to continue to do more. I think in the space and satellite areas, this could be most acute, at least in the short term. So there should be opportunities to work there together on those issues. And then long term, my hope would be that Australia could work more on its energy policy and provide more exports to the region. I know that may be in contrast with some of the climate 2050 goals and the net zero goals of 2050 for Australia, but providing stable source of energy to some smaller partners throughout the Indo-Pacific region is a great opportunity to prevent them from falling capture to China and their promises of cheap energy, cheap telecommunications networks, and all of the kind of strings that come along with that. So I think cooperation, obviously along with the US, Japan, and others in that space, will be important moving forward as well.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like AUKUS is on firm footing, regardless of who wins in November, but I will not commit you to making any announcements now, unless you want to share something.
No, I am speaking for myself only here. I know that the former Prime Minister Morrison has said that he thinks that a possible Trump administration would not change anything. So
thanks so much, Eric. As I foreshadowed at the beginning of the episode, it would be great if you had a stat or a figure to share with us based on today's conversation.
Yeah. I think 90% the number, and that's how much of the world's kind of rare earth supplies go through China, are produced and processed there. So that's a staggering number, I think.
Thank you so much, Eric. I really appreciate you giving us time to discuss these really important issues. And I look forward to reading more about your many accomplishments across the world at this point. So I really enjoy this time you've given us today. So thank you.
Thanks, Jared. It was great talking with you today, and looking forward to hopefully following up and continuing and doing another podcast in the future. As we wrap up, I want to highlight that there are a number of other podcasts that the Study Center puts out. Not only do we have this briefing room, but we also have the CEO, Mike Green, his podcast, The Asia Chessboard, which he does with the CSIS think tank based in DC. We also have the USSC live series where you can hear our live events, including our Election 2024 series. Thank you again for listening to The Briefing.